this on? Oh, I guess it is. Thought I'd better test it first thing. Good afternoon, everybody. As Susan said, my name is Laura Schmidt. I'm a biologist with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources based out of Milwaukee. I'm also one of the co-chairs of the Lake Michigan Lake Trout Working Group, along with Sarah Patel with the Fish and Wildlife Service. So I'm here today to present a Lake Trout Working Group update for you. First, I'd just like to acknowledge the many members of the Lake Trout Working Group. We have members from many state, federal, and tribal agencies across the lake, and everybody on this list has contributed to the data that I'm going to be presenting today. So the fish community objectives for Lake Michigan, as they relate to lake trout, identify preferred basic harvest parameters, along with ultimately establishing a self-sustaining lake trout population. And the salmon and trout objective specifically is to establish a diverse salmoning community capable of sustaining an annual harvest of 2.7 to 6.8 kilograms. And the yellow shading on the figure on this graph establishes that 2.7 to 6.8 range. So you can see the total salmoning harvest for Lake Michigan from about 1985 to 2025 on the top line with the triangles. The bottom line is lake trout harvest only. In 2025, total salmoning harvest was approximately 2.86 million kilograms, which was meeting the fish community objective for the fourth year in a row after a period of below target levels from about 2015 to 2021. The lake trout harvest specifically was about 430,000 kilograms. And so the second portion of this objective is actually to maintain 20 to 25% of that harvest being lake trout, which, as you can see, we are below that objective. In 2025, lake trout harvest was only 15% of the overall salmoning harvest. This wasn't exactly a surprise. In the same time period that we're seeing decreasing proportions of lake trout harvest, salmon harvest is increasing. So we think that explains a lot of the decline in lake trout harvest. And the second objective within the fish community objectives is to establish that self-sustaining lake trout population. But in addition to this, the Lake Michigan Committee has identified an interim rehabilitation goal, which is to reestablish in high priority areas of Lake Michigan a diversity of primarily lean lake trout populations predominantly supported by natural reproduction. So evaluation objectives have been established as targets to assess these goals, and these are based on increasing overall abundance, adult abundance, and genetic diversity, detecting viable eggs, building spawning populations, and then detecting recruitment of wild fish. Before I adjust the objectives, I just wanted to take a minute to introduce the stock assessment units. And these are basically the catch and age modeling units that are used across most of the lake to either manage lake trout populations or describe other metrics. So you can see we have multiple of the Michigan models, as well as two for Wisconsin and then Indiana and Illinois waters. And the data that I'm presenting today is mostly going to be summarized by these units, and I'll explain when it's not. So the first objective relates primarily to stocking, and this is in two ways. There's stocking multiple strains, as well as an identified target for lake trout in Lake Michigan. So the figure that I'm showing here today shows the number of lake trout stocked by strain in Lake Michigan from 1998 to 2025. There's a total of 8 strains that were stocked over this time period, all of which were lean strains, except for the Klondike Reef strain that was stocked on the Southern Refuge. One thing I want to point out right away, I noticed this morning that my legend is cut off, so I apologize for that. I think it's important to highlight that the purple bars indicate the Seneca Lake strain, which is important because, of course, we've stocked a lot of the Senecas in Lake Michigan over this time period. And the yellow bars are the Huron-Perry Sound. So with that in mind, over the last 10 to 12 years, the primary genetic strains stocked in the Lake Michigan are the Senecas, the Perry Sound, the Klondike Reef, and then Lewis Lakes. The second portion of the stocking objective is that the Lake Michigan Committee has established a maximum target of 2.285 million yearling equivalents being stocked in the Lake Michigan per year. In 2025, just over 2.2 million lake trout were stocked in Lake Michigan, so that met that target. And the other thing that I wanted to mention about stocking is that lake trout stocking has primarily shifted to offshore reefs. So the figure here shows the locations of lake trout that were stocked in 2025. So you can see for the most part, we're focusing on the Northern Refuge, the Southern Refuge, which is number 2, and then Julian's Reef in Illinois waters. although there's some other exceptions to that, primarily Grand Traverse Bay and some nearshore waters in MM5 and MM6. The second objective is to increase overall abundance, and this is in part evaluated by our standardized spring survey, known as LWAP, during which all agencies are following the same sampling protocols and sampling lake trout in the spring, where we assume the population is mixed. Each black dot that you can see on the map here is an individual lift location in 2025. So you can see that we have pretty good coverage of the entire lake in both nearshore and offshore areas. The biggest exceptions are, of course, Green Bay and then some of the nearshore areas in Wisconsin waters, such as WM6. And the specific spring objective is to increase the average catch per unit effort to 25 lake trout per 1,000 feet of net in graded mesh gill net spring surveys lake-wide. Some of you in the back might have a difficult time seeing some of this. I apologize for that, but I think the important thing to look at here really is the trends. So the solid orange line indicates that 25 fish per 1,000 foot benchmark. The orange dots is the total CPE of lake trout in each of these individual stock assessment units. So that's stocked and wild lake trout combined. And the blue dots are just wild fish. So at a glance, this benchmark has not been met lake-wide during this time period, which is 1998 to 2025. But there are areas where in recent years we have seen progress towards meeting this benchmark or even exceeding it, primarily in Grand Traverse Bay, which is MM4, or the box on the top, and then the Southern Refuge, which is the box in the bottom. One thing to note is that the Southern Refuge is on a different axis on this figure, just because our catch rates have been so high that we wouldn't see anything else if I didn't put it on a separate axis. So that's what we did. But yeah, you can see that Grand Traverse Bay and both the Southern Refuge have exceeded this benchmark in combined catch per unit effort. Also notable is MM5, which we have seen some progress in, and then an increase in wild fish seen in Illinois waters as well as Grand Traverse Bay. Although this is not a specific metric identified, we do think it's important to, of course, highlight mortality and watching mortality rates. We're still waiting on the 2025 lamprey wounding data, but you can see here from the figure that was provided by Fish and Wildlife Service that the lake trout target wounding rate of under 5 marks per 1,000 or per 100 lake trout has been met in general since about 2015. We don't expect any differences in 2025. And we also have mortality rates here from some of those catch at age models. Overall, mortality rate has been pretty low lake-wide. We do see higher mortality rates in northern Michigan waters than we do in southern or central, but overall, maintaining mortality rates fairly low. So the third objective is to increase adult abundance. And again, this is in part evaluated by our fall spawning surveys. Similar to spring, each dot on the map here is showing individual locations of lifts in 2025. One thing I'd like to note is that some of our sampling plans were derailed by high wind and weather and everything else that we deal with in the fall. So there's less locations on this map because of that reason. And the fall survey CPE benchmark is to increase or maintain that average catch per unit effort of 50 lake trout per 1,000 feet of net during fall assessments. So the data here is actually presented by individual spawning reef rather than those stocking locations. And again, the solid purple line is indicating that 50 fish per 1,000 foot benchmark. The purple dots are showing total CPE, so stocked and wild combined, and then the orange dots is wild fish only. So here there's certain areas too where we're also seeing progress being made. One of which is Grand Traverse Bay, which you can see here. That's Grand Traverse Bay in the west and eastern portions. Waukegan and Julian's Reef in Illinois waters, we're obviously seeing lots of progress or meeting this metric or exceeding it. Arcadia, and then the Southern Refuge, which is the northeast and the east reef here. Also notable, again, is an increase in wild fish in a lot of these locations, especially in Waukegan Reef and Julian's Reef. So Illinois waters, we're seeing some of those wild fish even meeting that benchmark, even though the benchmark is for combined lake trout. The fourth objective is determining viable eggs, and we're defining that as detecting lake trout eggs with a thiamine concentration of greater than 4 nanomoles per gram. We're still waiting on the data for 2025 for this, but so I'm just showing the long-term trends here from 1998 to 2024. But again, that orange bar is showing that 4 nanomoles per gram benchmark, and overall, you're looking at it lake-wide, we can see that we're meeting this metric in determining eggs above that threshold. Objective 5 is building spawning populations. And this is really evaluated actually by two separate metrics set by the Lake Trout Working Group and the Lake Michigan Committee. The first for building spawning populations is to attain spawning populations that are at least 25% female. So the purple bar here is that 25% female. This data comes from spawning surveys. So again, I'm presenting it by individual spawning reef. And if you just look at this, quick glance, lake-wide, this is another objective that we've been meeting for the most part over the time series. And the second portion of this is spawning populations that contain 10 or more age groups older than age 7. So just to break down this figure a little bit, the y-axis here is the count of ages. So we're looking at how many ages we're seeing overall in the spawning surveys and how many of them are over age 7. So that orange line here is showing that benchmark of, that's the orange line is set at 10 age groups. So anything over that is 10 or more age groups older than age 7. And the areas where we're really meeting this metric, we see this in MM67, in Illinois waters, and then Wisconsin waters, both outside and within the Southern Refuge. And the final objective that I'm going to address today is detecting recruitment of wild fish. One of the data sources that we use for this is the USGS bottom trawl survey. And so this is showing the bottom trawl abundance and number of fish per hectare from 1985 to 2025. And you can see that we're seeing increases in wild juvenile lake trout caught in Frankfurt, Waukegan, Saugatuck, and in some cases, Sturgeon Bay, at least from 2018 to 2021. So just to go over a quick summary here, starting with the fish community objectives, the first fish community objective is to establish this diverse salmoning community between 2.7 to 6.8 million kilograms. This is one that we met in 2025. That 20 to 25% of salmoning harvest being lake trout was not met in 2025, but again, I think this can be easily explained just by the increased salmon harvest across the lake. Our second objective of increasing overall abundance, our stocking objectives we consider have being met, just over 2.2 million lake trout were stocked in 2025. And our mortality rates are remaining generally low. Sea lamprey mortality rates are meeting that target. However, that spring CPE benchmark is not being met lake-wide, although we're seeing progress in specific areas. For increased adult abundance, this is a metric we're meeting on both fronts with both that fall CPE of greater than 50 lake trout per 1,000 feet of met, and then detecting viable eggs. For building spawning populations on a lake-wide basis, that 25% female benchmark is something that we see every year. And the number of age groups over age 7 is being met in certain locations, primarily MM67, Wisconsin waters, and then Illinois. And for detecting recruitment of wild fish, wild recruits have been detected in the bottom trawl surveys, highest in MM5 in southern Lake Michigan. And then the CPEs of wild lake trout has been increasing on spawning reefs of western Lake Michigan, the Southern Refuge, Julian's Reef, and Waukegan Reef. And then finally, I just wanted to give a quick overview of some other things that the Lake Trout Working Group has been working on over the past year and has planned for this year. Of course, we're going to take the data that I presented today and produce the 2025 Lake Trout Working Group report, which is one of the major tasks assigned to the Lake Trout Working Group. There's an ongoing review of those Southern Lake Michigan catch and age models that we'll be continuing this year. And then finally, there's been a lot of discussion of research priorities within the working group and which ones that we would want to prioritize, including a lot of interest in telemetry and movement studies and discussion with the new telemetry working group, and then talking about just genetics of these wild recruits that we're seeing. So with that, thanks for having me here today, and I'll take any questions if there's time.